My name is Mike Kennedy, and I'm introducing Corey Streitwieser. Corey is a senior classics major in the College of Arts and Sciences. His senior thesis treats both the rise of literate culture in ancient Greece and identity formation among early 4th century BCE Athenian philosophers and mathematicians, with an emphasis on Plato's role in forging a robust identity for Greek mathematics. As a McNair scholar, Corey completed a research project which yielded a forthcoming article that identifies several self-authorizing tactics Plato employs in his Gorgias to differentiate his philosophical school from those of his competitors. In his time at BC, Corey completed 2 advanced study grants supporting his intensive Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek study, and also served as an undergraduate research fellow. His lecture is titled Rhetoric and the Cult of Athenian Democracy. Please help me welcome Corey.
Hello, so let's get the obvious out of the way. I'm Corey Streitwieser. I'll be talking about the rhetoric and the cult of Athenian democracy. So what I want to start off with is just giving a little roadmap. The first thing that we're going to talk about is the Athenian political structure and why rhetoric was an integral part of Athenian civic participation. The second thing that I'm going to talk about is civil conflicts that are going on in our time period, the mid-5th century and the late 5th century, namely something called the Peloponnesian War, little tiff. Then we're going to go on to an orator's actual historical take on this event, Thucydides, and finally we'll conclude with how Thucydides navigates the problem of language, which Thucydides believes, and to put it simply, Thucydides thinks that as society breaks down, so does language, therefore our ability to interact and communicate with each other is degenerated. So let's start with the Athenian democratic structure. So it's a little complicated, to say the least. If you remember that meme that went around, this is the formula that broke the economy. This is the kind of formula that broke the Athenian democratic entity in the 5th and 4th century. It was remade in the 4th century though. But what we're really worried about, if you go up to that top part, right? The Athenian assembly. So as you can see, I very worryingly put question marks and exclamation points. About 6,000 citizens participating in the assembly in a time when there are not 6,000 people here and I need a microphone. So you can only imagine the problems that are going on in the Athenian assembly. What happened is rhetoric became a way in which you could have 6,000 citizens participating all at one time in one meeting place, wherever that was. And everybody could get together and be controlled by these rhetors who would deliver speeches. These speeches then in turn gave advice. The Athenian assembly would vote on these things. And in this way, 6,000 citizens could forge an important part of the Athenian political process. My point here is that rhetoric was super, super important. So what were our rhetors advising the assembly about? Well, they were advising something called the Peloponnesian War. So after the Persian Wars, which happened in the earlier 5th century, we have a 50-year period of peace. And in this time of peace, Athens became a great and powerful entity. And it also found a ton of silver in a place called Laurium, and they used this money to create things like the Parthenon. This is not the actual Parthenon, this is a recreation in Tennessee. They weren't so good that it still looks this good, so it's a little less nice now. But on the other side, you're going to see what happens in the Peloponnesian War when Athens, of course, goes against Sparta. They are destroyed. Athens loses the war, and this is actually a very sad scene. This is the Sicilian expedition where Athens will lose most of her ships. The writer, the star of the hour, Thucydides, will later say that in this battle, Athens lost everything, ships, men, then he, in italics, goes everything. So it's very sad. So let's talk about 2 rhetors. So we have Pericles. Pericles is what we would consider a good rhetor. He gives good advice to the assembly, and things function really well. So if we go back, that Parthenon that you see right there, that is the work of Pericles. Pericles never, so we are told, he never cared about getting elected. He only cared about giving good advice. Is that true? Probably not, but that's what we're told, and it's a good story. On the other hand, we have Alcibiades. Bad guy. Alcibiades is the one who convinces Athens in a time of peace to break the peace with Sparta and to re-enter the war. When they re-enter the war, this is the first thing that happens. They get into into the Sicilian expedition, and all of their ships are lost. Alcibiades was supposed to be the general. He went AWOL during this, and that's part of the reason that that's happening with the ships and all the people suffering. It's not a good story. My point being, though, that rhetors have a tremendous amount of power. When you have good rhetors, you have things like the Parthenon. bad rhetors, you have things like the Sicilian expedition. So let me introduce the man of the hour, Thucydides, who's our historian. Just to give you a little background, he's roughly contemporaneous with people like Plato. His work is published maybe 10 years before Plato's earlier dialogues are published. So that gives us, he's right at the kind of beginning of the 4th century, right talking about the late 5th century. And this is his work. Thucydides writes the history of the Peloponnesian War. Now, as Thucydides talks a lot about oratory and talks a lot about speech giving, he records, in fact, all the speeches that I told you about with Pericles and Alcibiades. He's the one that gives us those speeches because Pericles and Alcibiades not publish what they wrote, partially because they didn't want anyone to know. It's always safer if you don't have things in writing. Good advice. So Thucydides talks a lot about oratory. But then Thucydides also, because he talks a lot about oratory, has to talk a lot about language. So here I've given you the programmatic statement in Greek from Thucydides' opening of the Histories. I am Thucydides, an Athenian. I compile a war of the Peloponnesians, the Peloponnesian War between the Athenians and the Spartans, blah, blah, blah. And in doing this, he focuses a lot on language and how language broke down. What I'd like to focus on is how Thucydides, in just a few chapters, gives a really compelling argument about the problem of language, specifically when he talks about civil conflict in Corcyra. So at Corcyra, we have a ton of stuff going on. So Corcyra is that little island that I've put that big circle around. The circle eclipses the island. And as you can see, it's green, so it's rolling with Athens at this time. It's an Athenian ally. As Thucydides tells us, there's a huge problem in Corcyra. Language has broken down. Because they're in what they call stasis or civil war, they can't communicate with each other. What I want to underline is that words themselves have changed their meanings, and that's a bad thing. Words should have particular meanings. If I say that something is just, that should mean something. It shouldn't be fuzzy, according to Thucydides. But that's exactly what happens at Corcyra. So civil war, which everyone agrees should be a bad thing, started to sound like a good thing. It's this interplay between good meanings, bad meanings, transgressions of language, that dominate Thucydides' discussion of Corcyra. When we talk about our civil war, we don't talk about metaphysical causes that might have prompted the South and the North to get into that tiff called the Civil War. But Thucydides certainly drives some of these metaphysical ideas, that it's something that's actually happened to the language itself. Language itself has been corrupted. So I struggled today to figure out, well, where could we find a parallel to this, where we have conflict and linguistic struggles and things like that? And then I thought about the election on Tuesday. So what I want to talk about is maybe some contemporary implications on what Thucydides is getting at with this whole language thing. So I was thinking about our candidates. We have Barack Obama on the one hand, and we have Mitt Romney, right? Now, hopefully they're not going to be an Alcibiades-Pericles thing where one's really, really great and one's really, really bad, because that would be bad for the country. We should have two good options, right? But even if we don't have an Alcibiades-Pericles situation, we still have two people who are going under the same word. They both proclaim themselves as kind of the American par excellence. Barack Obama fashions himself as the guy who didn't really have it but then got it, and then Mitt Romney postures himself as the man who had it and then kept it. Both of these put this as the kind of par excellence American, but they're completely mutually exclusive. So what ends up happening is we get a sort of syncresis. So syncresis is the rhetorical structure in which we put two things that are different next to each other to emphasize their differences, with the added difficulty that there's no lexical distinction between the two things that are being compared. So in other words, we have one thing that is being called American, and like I've said a couple times now, American par excellence, and then in the exact opposite, which is also being called American par excellence. Considering this problem of language and communication, I guess what I wanted to point out is that we do have a sort of Corcyrian problem. If we're not killing each other in stasis as the Corcyrians did, we too have a sort of difficulty because we're all kind of talking past each other. It's difficult to have meaningful civic discourse if we are continually using the same words, but meaning radically different things. So like the Corcyrians who say that stasis is a good thing or civil war is a good thing, and those who argue that it is not, and those who argue that this brand of stasis is a good thing and that their form of stasis is a better thing, all of those conflicts kind of run parallel to the conflicts that we see today. So I guess what I wanted to bring out is that all across the ancient world, when we go to Thucydides, even Thucydides' predecessor Herodotus, Roman historiographers like Sallust, people like even Plato, worry about the ability of language to be consistent. Yet in the modern sphere, this seems to be a completely absent problem. We worry about how we're going to represent. how we're going to represent our ideas, where we worry about the sanctity of our vehicles for this representation. So people will say, I don't watch Fox News or I don't watch MSNBC. But what I'm wondering is, can we actually go further and wonder how much has the political strife that we see, characteristic of our time, because it's a difficult time, the economy and war and all of that, how do we actually understand this by looking specifically at the language? Has language itself been polluted? And if it has been, then how do we have meaningful civic discourse considering that? So that being said, I just wanted to emphasize that Thucydides is a great thing to read because he does underline important ideas that are important for today. So thank you.